What's up, world? Uko here from Better Therapy Now. Welcome to lesson 4, the science of cognitive bias and objectivity. So, what is a cognitive bias? It's a systematic pattern of deviation from rationality. So, not applying logic or facts to the decisions that you're making in the way that you're engaging in conversations. What we'll do is we'll review 7 cognitive biases. We'll analyze each one. And our goal is for you to identify which cognitive bias or biases you struggle with. And then we're going to challenge each one of those cognitive biases. To minimize cognitive biases in how we converse with others, we have to adopt techniques that promote self-awareness and critical thinking. Cognitive bias really corrupts the curiosity mindset because you go into a conversation already deciding what the conclusion is or with your mind made up. You're searching for something that you've already confirmed in your mind rather than being open-minded and searching for truth. What we'll do is a technique called deliberate reframing, where we take the cognitive biases that you struggle with and we deliberately challenge those assumptions and consider alternative viewpoints. Use a partner for this part. A partner will be essential in you developing your ability to converse with other people. You've talked about or practice doing open-ended questions and yes or no questions and the difference between those. We've done a lot of other social interaction skills. So now you should be becoming a little bit more proficient in how you engage in conversations. But if it's still difficult for you, there's ways to do this just by yourself. Just by journaling or writing down dialogue or a back and forth with yourself, considering different ways of thinking or different thoughts that you have. This will help you kind of visualize the conversation process before you actually go live with another person. But going through these lessons, especially the curiosity mindset lessons with somebody else so that you can practice some of these skills, will enhance your conversation proficiency. Consider a conversation less as a back and forth with somebody like a tennis match and more of an exploration of somebody else's mind and your mind. Your goal is to identify the blind spots both in other people and in yourself, and really more importantly, in yourself. I want you to have this goal. Hope that you find something that you're wrong about while maintaining a mean defense of what you believe. And some people might say, well, I don't believe anything or I'm not passionate about anything. If you are alive, you have thoughts about something that you're capable of defending. Don't get too deep in the beginning. Start simple. Make it fun. Talk about the differences in dating or the differences between men and women in dating, or sugary foods versus salty foods, or dog owners versus cat owners, or Android phones versus iPhones. Anything that you can kind of have a back and forth with so that you can start practicing this ability to explore other people's mind. And always resort back to this question of why. Why do you believe that? How does that make you feel? Why does that make you feel that way? Why do you think this way? Continue exploring and getting deeper and deeper. This is an excellent way to use the 5 whys technique to get deeper and deeper to like root causes. You'll see how and start to see a pattern in how people have these beliefs and how you have certain beliefs about things that are kind of simple on the surface level, but deep down have a much more profound meaning and more profound root cause. As you get deeper and deeper in the conversation and you continue asking why and continue exploring reasons why people think certain ways or why you think certain ways, you start to notice inconsistencies and things that are harder and harder to articulate to somebody else. And this is why kind of verbalizing it is so good or writing it down is so good, because it forces you to slow down and attempt to clarify what you're saying. And you can't really have huge gaps in knowledge, and things have to really connect. It forces you to connect. This, in some ways, writing it down is even better because it slows you down even more. And because you can write slow or you can speak faster than you can write. So connecting those gaps becomes even more essential. When it's difficult to connect the gaps, that's a signal that a cognitive bias might be lurking around, or you might be engaging in a cognitive bias. You want to kind of explore why things are difficult to articulate. The first cognitive bias is probably the most popular one, and that is confirmation bias. So confirmation bias is when we're searching, interpreting, or recalling information that aligns with a pre-existing belief. Example of this is only reading news sources that align with your ideology or with your political beliefs. This is contradictory to the curiosity mindset because you're not really open-minded and you're purposely searching for sources that are going to already agree with your pre-existing beliefs. It is natural and much more comfortable for the mind to kind of seek a confirmation of something that they already believe because it prevents them from having to change. If you change your beliefs, then you change the way you live your life. And that's kind of the fear that we internally have of it, of engaging with our most, I guess, closely held beliefs, our firmly held beliefs, is that if we challenge those and that challenge causes us to adjust the belief even slightly, it could change so many ways that we view the world and how we live our lives. And that can be very difficult for people. This is why the curiosity mindset is most challenging and most exciting, because it forces us, really, it challenges us. It challenges us to eventually change some aspect of our life. And hopefully, it challenges us to change something that's really close to us and dear to us and can be, in some instances, earth-shattering, but earth-shattering in a good way. The next cognitive bias that we'll talk about is anchoring bias. Anchoring bias is used very often in marketing by stores to really change your perception of the value of different goods within a store. So what it does is, anchoring bias is when we rely too heavily on the first thing that we see or the first thing that we hear about a thing or a person. So we're relying way too heavily on first impressions. Think of a store example. You walk into a store and the first things that you see have a certain price on them, associated with probably some type of brand. Through that, it kind of filters your perception of the value of other things in that store. And that's done very strategically and almost surgically to influence how people buy things and how they associate value with other things within that store. The same thing holds true for people as well. Their first impression that they present to you can serve as a sort of filter and influence how you see value in the other things that they say. But anchoring bias can have a counterproductive effect when it comes to the curiosity mindset, because say somebody tells you about something and it's a first impression that makes you think that they are wealthy. Then you'll kind of see them through that lens, and that could be a false impression. Overall, anchoring bias is a sort of hack that is counterproductive to being open-minded and really kind of seeking truth, both in other people and within the back and forth of a conversation. It works very closely with confirmation bias, because once you get that first impression that tells you one story, which might not even be the truth, and usually is not the truth about a person and the way that they live their life, you're kind of seeking confirmation of that first impression through the other things that they say. It makes it very difficult to ask them the question, why? Because you've already kind of decided the why. For example, if they graduated from a prestigious school, then every single thing that they say, like all the ways that they answer your whys, you're thinking in your mind, well, it's because they had this fancy education. The third cognitive bias that we'll talk about is availability heuristics. So availability heuristics is when we overestimate the importance of an event or the frequency that something occurs because it's easy to find examples. And this is usually really tied to emotions that we feel. And it's very possible or popular because of social media. People can kind of say anything and then provide an example of it, and it'll make the thing that they say sound much more frequent and much more, I guess, closely related to a fact. A couple of examples of this is misjudging compatibility in a relationship. Somebody might be with a partner where they have fights all the time, but they remember their first date that was really romantic and it was really nice, and there's a lot of emotions tied to it. So they misjudge the compatibility they have with their partner despite numerous negative interactions. Another one is the fear of rejection. So somebody might have approached a romantic interest and they were rejected in the past. So the emotional intensity associated with that makes them afraid to approach people now, because those emotions are still very vivid in their mind. They can recall that example from their memory really easily. So you see how availability heuristics can prevent us from making wise decisions. The next kind of bias is called hindsight bias. This bias is probably by itself decreasing the birth rate. This is when people look in the past and they think that events were more predictable than they actually were. This is the I knew it all along kind of approach. Some of the shortcomings of this is that it causes people to make really quick judgments of others based on past interactions with different people. It also leads to stereotyping, and it also makes people or encourages people to look for superficial red flags. So maybe they had a partner or a friend in the past who did something, and now they have this hindsight bias where they knew it all along and they think that they were, I guess, wiser than they actually are. And they begin looking for superficial red flags whenever they meet new people. This prevents somebody from being really open-minded and is also counterproductive in terms of having a curiosity mindset. The curiosity mindset wants you to take a chance due to that curiosity. It wants you to use curiosity as a tool, like latch on to the tool of curiosity and then be led by that. And what will happen is you'll begin to take chances, both in the actions that you're taking in life and the people with whom you're interacting with. The next cognitive bias is called attribution bias. So this is when you're basically judging people unfairly or judging situations unfairly. You judge yourself by external factors and you judge others by internal factors. So it gets really personal when it's with other people, and kind of like an innate issue when it comes to other people and their shortcomings. So for example, say you're in a bad mood. When you're in a bad mood, you might blame that on being sick or having a cold, or you might blame that on the traffic. So like other things outside of your control. But if somebody else is grumpy or in a bad mood, you'll blame it on like their personality type, or just say that they're generally a bad person. Attribution bias is counterproductive or contrary to the curiosity mindset because it encourages you to jump to conclusions a little bit too quick. The next cognitive bias that we'll talk about is overconfidence bias. So this is when you're more confident in your abilities or your knowledge than you really should be. The more overconfidence bias that you have, the less open-minded you're going to be. We want you to be confident in your beliefs, but we want you to be not so confident that you're incapable of flexibility in your decision making or your thought patterns, or incapable of change. Ultimately, the curiosity mindset wants you to be open to change and to actually make the steps to change if you find it necessary based on the conversations that you're having. And the last cognitive bias that we'll talk about is the bandwagon effect. So this is when people join certain ways of thinking or say that they have certain beliefs or even adopt certain beliefs because everybody else is doing it. So this is just kind of being part of the cool crowd, or just joining everybody else in terms of how they think, because that's the easiest thing to do. The bandwagon effect is popular for a whole lot of reasons, usually social reasons like the fear of missing out, the comfort in the safety kind of seen in numbers. Like if you see everybody kind of believing something, then you're like, oh, well, they must be right. Also, kind of the insecurity and lack of confidence that we have in our own convictions. So if we see that a lot of people believe one thing, then we're going to start questioning how we think, rather than just applying rationality to a situation and then making our own decision. This is why if you partner with somebody as you go through this course, try to find somebody that thinks different from you. Maybe not in every single area, but maybe just a couple of key areas where they think differently from you, so that they can kind of call you out on certain things, or so there can be something to actually debate about. This will kind of challenge the bandwagon effect, because if you select somebody who's very similar to you in terms of how they think and where they're from and how they live their life, then you guys might engage in just groupthink and agree on every single thing. And then there's no room for growth. In the worksheet, it reviews all 7 of the cognitive biases that we talked about. And then you're going to go through each one and try to come up with an example where you were exposed to the cognitive bias, whether you were doing the cognitive bias or you like saw somebody else suffer from the cognitive bias or do the cognitive bias. But you want to come up with real life examples so that there can be some sort of emotional connection to that. After that, you're going to identify which cognitive biases do you suffer from. Like, do you struggle with confirmation bias or availability heuristics? But try to find examples in your life where you've committed these certain cognitive biases, and then find the ones that you do most often. Once you identify the cognitive biases that you struggle with the most, you're going to attempt to challenge those cognitive biases. This is where a partner that kind of works with you going through this, or writing the stuff down so that you can look at it and try to be a little bit more objective in what you're saying and what you're talking about in terms of your biases, will be really helpful. What you'll experience as you kind of talk about the different cognitive biases and as you engage in conversations about them and back and forth about them, is that you're going to have to embrace a certain amount of failure and rejection while you're conversing. Because when you converse with somebody, there is an exploratory aspect that the curiosity mindset wants you to fully engage with. But when you're challenged, sometimes you are forced to, or really encouraged to, change the way you look at things or change the way you view things. And there is a sense of rejection in that and a sense of failure in that, because it could be long held beliefs that are being deeply challenged. The next lesson, we'll talk about embracing rejection and failure.